I never expected that a routine legal consultation would leave my heart racing before I even left the room. I had met with hundreds of clients before, heard all kinds of stories, walked through every kind of trouble. But something about the way Tommy stepped into my office that rainy Tuesday morning unsettled the rhythm I was used to. There was something in his eyes, something raw and searching, that made me sit up straighter in my chair the moment he walked in. I told myself it was just curiosity, professional instinct maybe, but the way my chest tightened said otherwise. Tommy was younger than most of my clients, probably no more than 25, with a face that looked like it belonged on magazine covers rather than in the middle of a legal mess. He was all soft edges and boyish charm, but his posture told another story entirely. Guarded, tense, like he was ready to run at the first sign of judgment. His hoodie was damp from the rain, and he smelled faintly of coffee and cold air as he sank into the chair across from me without saying a word. "My name's Adam," I began, offering him the same gentle tone I reserved for first-time clients who looked like they hadn't slept in days. "You can start wherever you're comfortable." He hesitated for a moment, biting the inside of his cheek, before he looked up. And when he did, it felt like someone had cracked open a window in a room that had been locked for years. "It's not something I've ever talked about before," he said quietly, his voice rough around the edges. "And I don't know who else I could trust." The way he said it, so deliberate, so filled with unspoken fear, made something stir inside me. Not pity, not even sympathy. It was deeper than that and more dangerous. As he started to talk, I listened, about the complicated situation he'd gotten into, the people he owed, the mistakes he made that kept multiplying like shadows in the dark. There was no violence, no criminal record, just a string of poor decisions mixed with even poorer luck. He hadn't hurt anyone, just himself. And now he was asking for help, trying to get his life back on track, hoping that someone like me might care enough to help him make that happen. We spoke for nearly an hour that first time, and though we kept things strictly professional, there were moments when our eyes met across the desk and something unspoken passed between us. Something neither of us had expected to feel in a room like this. When the session ended, I stood to shake his hand, and for a second too long, neither of us moved. His fingers brushed mine in a hesitant, searching way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And just like that, the line between lawyer and client, the line I had drawn so many times before, blurred even if only slightly. "I'll see you next week?" I asked, keeping my voice level, even as my thoughts betrayed me. He nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, I'd like that." As he walked out into the drizzle, I stayed frozen at my desk, wondering why his presence still lingered in the air long after he was gone. The second time Tommy came in, something had shifted, not just in him, but in me too. I noticed it in the way he walked through the door, this time without a hoodie clinging to his shoulders, his hair still damp from the rain but no longer hiding his face. He met my eyes faster. He sat a little closer to the edge of his seat. And when he spoke, his voice didn't tremble the way it had the week before. We dove deeper into his case, names, dates, documents. I kept my tone neutral, my hands steady, but inside, there was a quiet thrum of energy that hadn't existed in my office for a long time. I told myself after that first meeting that whatever I'd felt was a fluke, a passing curiosity. But now, sitting across from him again, I couldn't lie to myself. It wasn't passing, it wasn't fading, and it wasn't going away. Tommy rubbed his palms against his thighs as he talked, a nervous gesture that gave away the fear still riding under his skin. And when I leaned forward to explain a detail about his paperwork, his eyes flicked to mine and held. "I didn't think you'd remember me," he said suddenly, almost like it slipped out before he could stop it. I blinked, caught off guard. "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged, his smile barely there. "You probably see dozens of people every week." "I remembered you," I said simply, and immediately wished I hadn't let it sound so honest. He didn't say anything to that, but I saw the way his shoulders eased slightly, the way his lips parted as if to speak before he changed his mind. We kept working, pages shuffled, pens scratched, but the energy between us wasn't professional anymore. It was personal and growing louder by the second. Near the end of the session, I stood to grab a file from the cabinet behind me, and when I turned, he was watching me. Openly this time, without apology. I didn't look away. I didn't want to. Neither of us said anything as I handed him the next set of forms. But our fingers touched again. Too long, too deliberate to be an accident. And my breath caught in my chest. Something was happening. Not in the court system. Not in the paperwork. Right here. Between us. Our third meeting started like the others. Papers, questions, signatures. But something hung in the air now, weightier than anything written in Tommy's file. It wasn't just the glances or the way our fingers brushed when he passed me a document. Hey, thanks for watching until this point. Please leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. It really helps us grow the channel and reach more people. And hey, thank you very much. Let's get back to story. It was the way our silences began to stretch, not with awkwardness, but with something far more charged. He sat across from me, chewing on the end of a pen cap, brows knit in concentration as I explained a section of his case. The soft furrow between his eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth as he listened. It was all too easy to notice, too easy to let my gaze linger. And when his eyes flicked up to mine mid-sentence, I didn't pretend to look away. "Can we take a break?" he asked, and there was a softness in his voice that made it sound more like a request for something else entirely. "Sure," I replied, standing and stretching my arms over my head, trying to clear the tension from my body. "You want coffee? Water?" He shook his head and stood too, pacing toward the wide windows that overlooked the quiet street outside. The gray afternoon light painted his profile in soft contrast, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, his shoulders slightly hunched. I stepped closer, not even realizing how naturally the space closed between us until I was standing just a foot away. "You don't talk like a lawyer," Tommy said suddenly, not turning to face me. I smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," he said, and then after a beat, he turned toward me. "You look at me like a person, not like a mess." I should have said something safe, something to steer us back to business. But I couldn't, because he was right. "I don't think you're a mess," I said quietly. "I think you're trying." The air thickened again. There was no desk between us now. No legal documents, no separation. Just two people standing in the soft light, breathing the same uncertain air. Tommy stepped forward. Not much, just enough. And before I could think of all the reasons why this shouldn't happen, I felt his fingers brush my wrist, tentative, featherlight, as if he was afraid I might flinch. But I didn't. I turned my hand over, letting his fingertips skim across my palm. It was the most innocent contact I'd had in years, but it hit me like fire. "I shouldn't," he whispered, voice catching. "But I can't stop thinking about you." My heart beat too fast. My mouth was dry, and when I reached up, sliding my hand gently to the side of his face, he didn't pull away. His breath caught as I brushed my thumb against his cheekbone, his skin warm under my touch. We stood there for a moment, frozen in a fragile space neither of us wanted to break. Then he leaned in. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't urgent. It was slow, hesitant, filled with all the things we hadn't said in words. His lips were soft and uncertain at first, like he was still deciding whether it was allowed. But when I kissed him back, the answer was clear. His hands slid to my chest, fingers fisting lightly in the fabric of my shirt. Mine moved to his waist, steadying him as our bodies pulled together like magnets finally giving in. It didn't go further than that, not yet, but the intent was there. In the way he pressed closer, in the way I let him. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, he kept his forehead against mine. "We should get back to work," he murmured, lips brushing mine. I nodded but didn't step away. "Yeah, we should." Neither of us moved, and both of us knew this case had just become much more complicated. The kiss lingered between us like smoke in the air, no longer visible, but impossible to ignore. We had gone back to the table, back to the papers and contracts and legalese, but the energy in the room had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Every time I reached across the desk, Every time our eyes met over the top of a document, the memory of his lips brushing mine burned just beneath the surface. Tommy was quieter now, but not closed off. His posture had softened, his gaze steadier. There was a subtle confidence in the way he moved, like he'd been seen, really seen, and hadn't been pushed away. I watched him underline a section of a clause with the tip of his pen, and I knew I wasn't thinking like a lawyer anymore. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, not looking up from the page. "Law?" I asked, clearing my throat. "Almost 10 years. You ever get close to someone like this before?" I paused, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said someone like this. Like we had quietly acknowledged that what happened between us meant something, even if neither of us had a name for it yet. "No," I said honestly, my voice softer now. "Not like this." Tommy looked up at that, and for a long second we just stared at each other.
No desk, no papers.
Just two people on opposite sides of something that felt dangerous and honest and necessary all at once. "I didn't come here looking for whatever this is," he said. "But I haven't felt safe around someone in a long time." The weight of his words settled between us, heavier than anything in his file. I could have told him I felt the same. I could have leaned across the desk again, could have touched his hand the way I wanted to. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Come on," I said, nodding toward the break room. "We've been at this for 2 hours. Let's breathe." He followed me down the hall without a word. The firm was nearly empty that afternoon, a rare lull that felt like a gift. The break room was quiet, sun filtering in through the blinds, dust dancing in the light like everything had slowed down just for us. I poured 2 mugs of coffee, handed him one. Our fingers touched again, briefly, but deliberately. He smiled into the rim of the cup, and I looked away before I did something reckless. "What happens if this thing between us keeps going?" he asked, voice low but steady. I leaned against the counter, staring into the dark swirl of my coffee. "I don't know," I said. "It probably complicates everything. But it already has, hasn't it?" I looked at him then. The way he stood in the soft light, mug cupped between his hands, eyes steady but unsure, like he was trying to figure out if I would meet him halfway. "It has," I admitted, "but I don't regret it." He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for days, and without thinking, I stepped toward him. Just a small step, but enough that he reached for me, one hand brushing lightly against my waist. It wasn't a kiss this time. It was a lean, a quiet press of his body against mine, seeking comfort, maybe permission. I let my hand settle gently against the back of his neck, my fingers threading into his hair. We stood there like that for a while. No words, no movement, just the quiet hum of electricity between us. Two people who shouldn't have crossed a line, already too far past it to pretend otherwise. And still, I didn't want to move. Not yet. That break was meant to last 5 minutes, maybe 10. But we never went back to the table. We stayed in the quiet of the break room, bathed in that low afternoon light, our bodies barely touching, but our breathing perfectly matched. Tommy's hand, still resting on my waist, felt steady now, no longer hesitant, no longer asking for permission. And when I brushed my fingers down the curve of his neck, I felt the way his body reacted to even the gentlest touch. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," he whispered, eyes locked on mine. "Like this isn't real, like you're just being kind." My heart tugged at the words, at the years of doubt they carried. I cupped his cheek with one hand, the other settling softly against his back, pulling him just a little closer. "This isn't about kindness," I said quietly. "It's about you." Tommy let out a breath, almost a laugh, as he leaned his forehead against mine. There was tension in his shoulders, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation, maybe even desire, barely restrained beneath the surface. My thumb brushed the edge of his jaw, slow and deliberate, and when I pressed a soft kiss to the corner of his mouth, I felt him melt into it. This time, the kiss grew faster. Still gentle, still tender, but hungrier now. His hands slid up my chest, fingers catching the collar of my shirt as he pressed against me, like he needed to feel every inch between us disappear. I kissed him deeper, letting my hands roam up his back, memorizing the shape of him, the way his breath hitched when my fingertips grazed beneath the hem of his t-shirt. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The sound of our breathing filled the room, the subtle rustle of fabric, the quiet gasp when I kissed the edge of his jaw and down to the hollow of his throat. He clung to me like he didn't want to be anywhere else, and I held him like I wasn't going to let him go. There was no rush, no need to hurry toward anything more. But the want was there, and we both felt it, growing hotter with every small touch, every slow press of lips, every breath shared in the spaces between kisses. His hands slid beneath the hem of my shirt, fingertips exploring slowly, reverently. He touched me like he didn't know he was allowed, like every inch of skin was a secret he'd never been told he could uncover. I guided his hand higher, across my ribs, my heart pounding beneath his palm. "This okay?" he whispered, his voice barely there. "Yes," I breathed, and kissed him again, this time slower, deeper, like I wanted to tell him everything I couldn't say out loud. We never undressed fully. There were boundaries still standing between us, ones we both respected without having to name them. But by the time we pulled apart, our clothes were rumpled, our skin flushed, and our hearts wide open. Tommy looked at me like he didn't recognize himself anymore, and maybe I didn't either. "I don't know what happens after this," he murmured, running a hand through his hair, still catching his breath. I reached for him again, brushing my thumb across his lip, feeling the heat still lingering there. "Then don't think about after," I said. "Just stay here with me." And he did. For the first time since he walked into my office, he let himself relax completely. He leaned against me, his head resting on my shoulder, my hand resting on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath settle into something calm. For now, that was enough. The room was quiet again, though not in the way it had been before. This silence was softer, more intimate, the kind that settles in when two people finally stop pretending they're not feeling something real. Tommy sat beside me on the worn office couch, legs curled up slightly, one arm draped lazily across his stomach as he stared at the ceiling with a faint, crooked smile. His hoodie was on the floor, forgotten. My tie was halfway undone. The papers and legal notes still sat on the table a few feet away, untouched since our break became something more. "I didn't expect this," he said eventually, his voice husky, but not uncertain. "Neither did I admitted, my hand still resting gently on his knee, thumb tracing slow circles through the denim of his jeans. "But I'm not sorry." He turned to look at me, really look, and something in his expression shifted, softened. "You don't think I'm a mess?" I shook my head slowly. "I think you've been through a lot, and I think you're more than the parts you're afraid people will see." Tommy exhaled, leaning into my shoulder with a kind of trust that felt new, untested but genuine. I let my arms slide around him, holding him close, the warmth of his body, the calm of his breath against my chest. It all felt like something I hadn't realized I needed until now. "This changes things, doesn't it?" he asked quietly. "It might," I said, "but not everything has to make perfect sense right away." He nodded, then added, almost shyly, "Will you still help me?" I smiled, pressing a kiss into his hair. "Of course I will, as your lawyer, and whatever else this turns into, I'll be here." Tommy let out a soft laugh, burying his face into my shirt. "God, I really didn't plan this." I ran my fingers down his back, feeling the ease in his posture now, the quiet he'd found, even just for a moment. "Neither did I said. "But maybe it's exactly what we both needed." Outside, the sky had cleared, the rain finally passed, and inside, with nothing but the low hum of the building around us, we sat in the space between what was and what could be. Not finished, just beginning.